really interesting challenge. And I have with me today one of my very, very favorite collaborators, Mr. Ray Boisvert from IBM.
Hey Vivienne, hello folks. Bienvenue tout le monde, grand plaisir d'être parmi vous. Great topic. I've been looking forward to our discussion, and of course we're talking about critical infrastructure. We're talking about the preventive aspects of it. Do people look at this as an effort by others to disrupt them? Is it a case of espionage? Is it a case of snooping around for future destruction, or perhaps it's for stealing? Sometimes it's things like extractive technologies, or perhaps it's things around utilities and energy. So there's a lot of stuff that's going on, and it's such an important topic because, in my view, Vivienne, it represents the essence of modern society. It's everything we take for granted day in, day out. And as we've seen of late, and we're going to get into that, of course, is a question of how much of that has been under attack of late.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that one of your favorite keywords when we talk with our customers and our partners about cybersecurity is complacency and the things that we do take for granted. So I think that's one of the reasons we both jumped at the opportunity to discuss critical infrastructure.
For sure.
Critical infrastructure challenge. Yeah. Okay. So the critical infrastructure challenge statement that we chose for our presentation was the concern that critical infrastructure in particular, such as energy and utilities, could be targets for disruption and or espionage. And obviously, either of those scenarios has dramatic and terrible consequences. We've seen just how reliant we are in the past year and a half on internet itself. Without internet, there's no Uber Eats, and then everything in my house comes to a screeching halt. And the challenge that we took on was defining not just the problem space, but also the kind of activities and the preparatory steps that these sorts of organizations would have to take to build a proper cyber resilience program. So I think before we go into that, we wanted to spend a little bit of time exploring the problem space and what is it particular about critical infrastructure that makes it susceptible to espionage, not just to garden variety cyber disruption, but in particular espionage and those sort of related activities.
Absolutely. And I'm the IBM security strategist for our services practice. And the reason I love playing this role, because it's all around this idea that at the end of the day, there are lots of motivated threat actors in the environment, and there has to be a recognition of the environment we're working or operating in. And we also have to recognize there are mitigation strategies. But also, I take a look at everything we do at IBM, and as we do with our clients, is I take the view, and I've used my experience as a national security practitioner. I spent almost 35 years at the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. And when I left as the assistant director, we were very much starting to get our minds around the threats of cyber to critical infrastructure, everything from food security to energy security to actual threats to life. And for example, we've yet to actually see an event where outside of reports of a potential loss of life involving a critical infrastructure failure that was malicious in nature, I think we've been building up, though, in the last few years to a number of things that could be extremely disruptive, right to the point of severe or significant casualties. So it's something that definitely needs a deep conversation, and here's what here's what we're here to do for sure.
Yeah. I know you have stories, Ray. So tell me a story. Scare me. Tell me a story.
I'm a context guy, and I know we talked about this beforehand. I said, listen, I have a couple of ideas that I like to throw out there, but I thought as we looked at this title and as we built the framework around this particular presentation, what occurred to me most was that what we're seeing now isn't particularly new. And what we live through right now in our digital worlds is really just another manifestation of a physical environment. And it's much more animated. There's a volume issue. There's a velocity issue. It's far more complex. But again, being a student of history and being a national security practitioner, when I go back in the history books, I can come up with a half a dozen examples of things that are going on today went on back 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, just in a slightly different context. So here's one story that came to mind because I think it's really germane to the topic. There was an old, this is at the heart of the Cold War. So we're talking in the fall of 1982, just before Halloween. There was a KGB officer, and the KGB was the Soviet Union, or Russia, as it's known today. It was their security intelligence service. It was their foreign offensive service, like the CIA is in the United States. They were broken down in different directorates, and one of the colonels in the KGB, he was responsible for a section within what they call Line T, which was there for collection of scientific and technological information, ends up defecting to the French intelligence service. He brings a whole bunch of secrets, a whole bunch of volumes, but he also alerts the Western authorities, including Canada was allegedly involved from the archive material, involved in this caper, wherein the Soviet Union was about to commence or had finished building a very large, significant pipeline. It was going to bring in around $8 billion US in gas and oil production revenue for the country. So it's alleged that over a year, through this double agent, Western governments worked to create a device that could be implanted, a physical device within a pipeline to cause an explosion to disrupt that big piece of critical infrastructure that was so vital for the Soviet economy. As it turns out, and as it's been reported, and then as the historians continue to debate this story, there was a massive explosion in Siberia. It was deemed to be about 1/7 of the atomic bomb over Hiroshima or Nagasaki, and it was seen from a very, very great distance and flattened a large swath of forest and destroyed the pipeline for many years. So you fast forward to just a few years ago, and one wonders if that was a precursor to some other digital style attacks that we've seen, including some alleged by Western and other governments. And I think that's just the way things are. Critical infrastructure is seen as a prize. It's one where sometimes it's competition about who can own the resources, who can dominate them, and sometimes it's preparation for war. It covers the full spectrum.
Well, that's more than just an analogy. I mean, that's a perfect parallel. That's insider threat, that's data exfiltration, that's state-sponsored actors involved in the creation of a bespoke weaponized payload, and total destruction of critical assets. I mean, these are all things straight out of the cyber handbook as well.
Absolutely. And to suggest that things have changed, for sure. The technology has now made the efforts to disrupt or to spy and to commit espionage in some ways, or to be able to collect information, including intellectual property, a heck of a lot easier. So that's just a reality. So Hensel, how do we achieve a level where we're no longer at risk of getting to that moment of complete dystopia, the sort of stuff you see out of the movies, and this is not just fanciful conversation. These are things that over the last 2 months, there are a number of events that caught our attention.
Well, I think what's really interesting about that, I mean, your historical story is about a pipeline. And of course, right now in the summer of 2021, you say pipeline, everyone thinks about Colonial pipeline. And what's been really interesting about, the Colonial pipeline ransomware event and others like it is that even in these converged operational technology and IT type environments, which critical infrastructure installations tend to be, even in that kind of converged or operational environment, you don't even have to touch the operational side to cause disruption or to commit acts of espionage or data exfiltration. It's enough to go and mess around with stuff on the business operations or the IT side, which is exactly what we saw with the Colonial pipeline ransomware, right? All that you have to do with a lot of these facilities is tamper with their ability to do metering. You don't have to touch the operational side at all. Take down a couple of key IT systems. And we see this time and time again in attacks against OT and ICS environments. In particular, in the last few months, we've seen the rise of software supply chain attacks in particular, which is really exposing those IT vulnerabilities, which critical infrastructure environments are just as vulnerable to as strictly 100% classic IT business applications. It doesn't really matter anymore. Software supply chain attacks don't discriminate. Ransomware attacks don't discriminate.
No, and in fact, they become so sophisticated as opposed to being random acts and sometimes very bot driven. Now there's a lot more reconnaissance done in advance. There's a lot more social engineering. There's a lot more intelligence collection to be able to curate the right kind of targets in the right kind of sectors. And of course, it stands to reason that those in critical infrastructures, such as pipeline owners and others, are just ideal. They're ideal because they cannot withstand the scrutiny and the overwhelming need for them to be constantly operational. So any disruption, any threat of disruption could be very consequential for society. And there's political pressures, there's regulatory pressures, there are insurance pressures. And I guess really ultimately what's really turned it this summer has been the issue that we've seen a convergence. The convergence of a lot of geostrategic interests combined with criminal pursuits, and I guess mostly just this highly enabled group of threat actors that continue to cause havoc in what arguably could be or should be some of the best defended the networks that supply all these things that we need day in, day out.
Yeah, ransomware in particular is such a huge dilemma for everybody right now, right? Because as you said, in a critical infrastructure environment, you have to be operational. If you're looking at an 8-hour or 12-hour or 16-hour restart cycle, all it takes is one simple piece of ransomware or a denial of service attack to really compromise the efficacy or the productivity of your installation. In some cases, depending on what they tamper with, you could be looking at potential risk to health and safety. And ransomware has become a huge dilemma. You know, if you get hit with ransomware, should you pay? What are the consequences if you do?
Yeah, and I think the attacks against the food supply chain, looking at one of the, I guess, arguably the largest meat processing firm in the world, you look at the attack against the Irish National Health Service or their equivalent. These are classic examples where those are well-selected targets. Those are targets that are well-financed, and those are targets that are stuck. They're in a quite a dilemma. And when we've seen the evolution of the types of ransomware, the methodologies, the way they've encrypted, the way they've destroyed data, the way they've threatened to release data unless somebody pays, that clock is not just ticking. It's beyond that. The levels of pressure is being felt by the executive team, who in many cases I would suggest perhaps are not as well prepared as they thought they were. And there's nothing like having that opportunity to perhaps sit in, for example, our own Cyber Command, our whole immersive platform where we run a lot of our clients through, and our clients come in to spend some time in a cyber range where they can see what it's like to live in those worst moments of your life. And I think that you only do that once, and you will take a look at this threat environment very differently than you did perhaps 2 hours before.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the authorities have been really explicit. I'm thinking of the U.S. Treasury Department here, where he was explicitly advised that people should not pay the cyber ransom. And yet, recently we saw CNA Financial pay $40 million US to their attackers for that ransom, and that's not a typo. That's literal $40 million. So, I mean, this is obviously not going away. There's going to be a breaking point where the dynamics around ransomware and how we deal with it has to change, right? And there's got to be some shift in both public and private about how we combat this and what people can do.
No, for sure. The U.S.'s Treasury Secretariat, when they issued that particular bit of governance, they were very clear that the future may be consequential for those who pay. There could be allegations down the road, and I think what they're doing right now is signaling very clearly that at some point, if there is a belief that those funds that have been paid out through ransomware end up in the hands of terrorist entities or end up fueling criminal activity, it could provide some regulatory complications for that particular company. We've also seen the insurance companies in France one of the larger insurers there said that they will no longer pay. They will no longer underwrite any ransomware payments. And funny enough, some of the ransomware premier entities within that industry are they themselves being attacked and have suffered ransomwares, as you just suggested. So
Right.
I think that regulatory environment is changing, the insurance environment is changing, and at the end of the day, I think the public tolerance around this is changing rapidly.
So let's talk a little bit more about critical infrastructure. Let's get back to that. I mean, I guess what I wanted to dive into a little bit more is why are these critical infrastructure, like why are IT and OT and ICS environments still so vulnerable? And I posit that there's three main factors there. I mean, first of all, when you're talking about those kinds of converged industrial control environments, like power plants, like energy and utilities, like any kind of manufacturing, the complexity with just the sheer number and variety of devices and things operating in tandem is really, it's really complex to manage. And a lot of those devices on the operational side can't even be patched or secured in the sense that we on IT think about it. And the second factor is also just the criticality of these facilities, right? The fact that you can't afford that downtime. You have to be up and running. You have to be providing a very high level of service and availability in order to function. That's your whole raison d'etre. And finally, even in the most controlled or segmented of converged environments, there are always open doors and windows. And so, two of the things that you and I have often spoken about in cybersecurity about the importance of hygiene and of avoiding complacency, it becomes an even more complex challenge in an operational environment. Even the most secure and air-gapped of OT environments might have a web server somewhere in there that people aren't necessarily taking inventory of when they're looking at their cybersecurity controls or at the OT controls.
No, for sure. And let me be categorical about this one. There is no safe haven. There is no really absolutely air-gapped system. Why? Because there are insider threats. And if you look at the Stuxnet example that was alleged around the attack against Iranian centrifuges in the nuclear industry, going back almost about probably 7 years ago at this point, it's highly likely somebody walked in with a USB drive or something. And then, of course, the issue of there's always a printer on that network. There's always some lingering entity that touches the network. And that's the challenge around this question, too, is how do you obtain or how do you gain that absolute visibility on the network? How do you maintain it? And especially as you describe with the levels of complexity in your network, and you think about the partners, you think about a whole bunch of other groups and people and entities, and it's shifting and changing all the time. You throw in a global pandemic and suddenly having most of your workforce working in alternative places, many from home with less than stellar security situations at home just because of the nature of their networks, how they're defended, and the use of devices and so on. So we are really in a perimeter-less world. So that changes the equation for CISOs. And it really is a time for us to rethink that model completely.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're talking about control points literally being on people's kitchen tables. That's a big deal. And I think the other side of this too, whenever we talk about defenses, I always kind of think, well, what's happening on the adversary side? And you've already spoken about this a little bit, but the enemy has evolved significantly too.
Oh, it has. And we have seen a number of groups that have been identified publicly. So I think attributions become stronger. I think the will in a lot of Western and advanced economies has grown to a point where we're willing now to point fingers because we need to raise the cost of this. Part of that cost is identification of the adversaries who are wreaking this kind of havoc. Part of the problem, which is almost unsolvable yet at this point, is the vast majority of those cyber threat actors are operating what we call permissive environments. And so they're allowed to operate, and they're really they have some sort of sanctuary from law enforcement action in Western countries. That includes the RCMP in Canada, the FBI in the United States, and European policing agencies, and so on. So that becomes extremely problematic. And so as they continue to wreak havoc, they continue to improve. And I've heard different numbers, but let's say there's one global figure that's been thrown a lot, that by 2025, cybercrime is going to be worth about, or impacted around $7 trillion. And if only a fraction of that is turned back into R&D in the hands of adversaries, they are extremely powerful and about to become much more powerful.
Yeah, so that's good and frightening. Obviously, there's a lot of nuance to the threat and the risk and the things that we would need to do to defend. So, I mean, what can people do? I mean, obviously, some of the things that have to happen is there has to be some shifts in policy, in how every level of government interacts with each other, and how the regulators get involved, and some of these other trends. But from a practical point of view, what can organizations do if you're looking at building a cyber resilience program that's going to help you detect things like insider threat, espionage attempts, and disruption attempts in critical infrastructure? I think one of the things that we talk a lot in cybersecurity, right from the NIST framework, about the good old protect, detect, respond, etc. But one of the things that we wanted to talk about today is that buzzword that's on everybody's lips right now, and that's ZeroTrust. When we were preparing for this session, the words that you came up with, Ray, was persistent vigilance, which to me is all about ZeroTrust and the ZeroTrust mindset and framework. So very simply, when we talk about ZeroTrust security, we're talking about securing every user, every device, every connection, every time, right? Basic principles of least privilege access. Nobody should have any more there than the bare minimum amount of access required to do their specific job function. You look at principles like never trust, always verify. Verify every single user, every connection, every device. It doesn't matter, if Vivienne has done this thing 1,000 times before on attempt 1,001, you're still going to verify, even if it's the same device she's always used. And then finally, the third ZeroTrust principle is assume breach. Assume that they're in there. Assume that there's reconnaissance. Assume you're being surveilled. And your job now is to find them and shut that down. Your job is to detect and contain. And I think what's really fascinating about this, because everybody, most people, most customers that we talk to now are trying to wrap their heads around the ZeroTrust framework and what this means for their security agenda and their security programs. What I find really fascinating about the ZeroTrust approach and the ZeroTrust principles, especially when I'm talking to you, Ray, is that I don't think that any of this mindset is new to you.
No, because this is interesting. What you just described in full is really the reality, is that you can't buy this. This is not a device. This is not a piece of software or a complex weaving of a whole bunch of different solutions. This is a mindset. This is a preparatory approach. This is purposeful. It's really a counterintelligence mindset. Again, I go back to my roots. And we were, in the Cold War particularly, always assuming that we've been penetrated by a mole, because there was a long history of intelligence agencies in the West and in the Soviet bloc, including the USSR, constantly implanting agents, recruiting people, dangling people out there, having somebody defect who was a true defector, some were fakes. And there's this constant, what used to be called a wilderness of mirrors. So in order to navigate that wilderness of mirrors, you really have to have the counterintelligence mindset, which means, I hate to say, trust no one. You have to be careful, though, because culture matters in organizations. You never want to sow mistrust within your organization. But I also think there's room for clarity about, again, the way you're going to be purposeful in how you're going to secure the network, because the network belongs to all of us, and all of us have a responsibility in that. Therefore, all employees play a really big role in ZeroTrust as well. And going back to my intelligence roots and in that counterintelligence mindset is, it's somewhat about compartmentalizing certain things. It is about privileged access management. Absolutely. We'll come back to that, I'm sure. But there's also this idea that always assume that somebody's already creeping along and taking inventory of your assets, somebody's perhaps even been paid. There was a great story about Elon Musk and having somebody on his team at Tesla who was recruited by a foreign company who had very close links to the home country, who was paid $1 million to get one of his friends, who is still an employee at Tesla, insert a USB into the network. And so these things are real. That was widely reported in open source media. So I think that's the reality we all have to put our minds to and adopt zero trust.
Yeah, I think I tend to think very much in my job about cybersecurity use cases and a use case approach to, cybersecurity tools and cybersecurity programs. And I mean, when you talk about insider threat and lateral movement and, managing and privileged access management, I mean, this is all stuff that translates almost exactly from the cyber realm to the physical. This is like stuff that you would read in a John le Carré novel. Which now that I think about it, maybe it's not that surprising that I ended up in cybersecurity after all. So in the time that we have left, I think we should probably talk. We should talk about solutions that people can use and the steps that people need to take in order to build, a zero trust. A zero trust type of cyber resilience program. I mean, I love the fact that you use the word purposeful to describe this, Ray, because I think that's really important. My zero trust is not going to be your zero trust. Zero trust is going to mean different things to different people depending on what you have to secure, what constraints you have, what your regulatory environment is, what your ability is to adopt these technologies, and how much you're able to work with your culture as well to embody those zero trust principles. But there are some overall driving principles and strategies that everybody could use.
Absolutely, and this is what you also have to do, is bring to bear that expertise. And rarely is that expertise can be found wholly inside an organization. I don't care how big it is. And you also need that outside external opinion on how things need to proceed. And you need that sort of most advanced and most respected points of view in a really highly clustered industry. And this is part of the challenge. There's been a lot of talk about zero trust. This has been around for a decade. We feel we've reinitialized it and reinvented it in a way because we brought our premier leading security services practice, combining with some of the world leading security technologies out of IBM. But it's also this idea that when you take a look at the larger landscape, it's confusing out there for CISOs. It's confusing for CIOs. It's confusing for boards and for C-suites because there are a lot of pretenders around security. There's a lot of confusion. There's a great cover story in The Economist this week around basically the scourge of ransomware. And most of the things that are underlining is that there's way too much cybersecurity nonsense and not enough true solutions. And I think that's probably one of the things I wanted to underline is you have to reach out and get the best possible advice around this complex issue.
Yeah, and I think also understand things like vulnerability detection, in particular for critical infrastructure, is really, really important because everybody is going to have a different vulnerability thumbprint. Mm-hmm. So it would make sense that you have to understand what those vulnerabilities are if you're going to secure them. And I mean, we're in the 21st century now. I think of when I embarked on my career in IT, cybersecurity meant access control-less and virus signatures, and it was all about frictionless user experience and trying to make things easy. And of course, it's a completely different world now. I think that we're at a point right now where things like AI assist in cybersecurity solutions is going to be table stakes. It's not right now, right? There are a lot of people. AI means a lot of different things. I always get really nervous when people ask me to speak about artificial intelligence in cybersecurity because it's still really murky about how AI can and should be used in our industry. But I think that in coming years, we're going to see some form of machine learning or cognitive or some kind of AI assistance be table stakes for most security programs and technology programs. Similarly, automation, right? I've heard you say before that automation begets automation. And guess what? The bad guys are using it. So too should the good guys, right? The good guys have to invest in the same areas and to the same extent that the adversary is. It only makes sense. And all of this is, of course, is coming down to how you wrap defense around every connection and how you give your teams that actionable insight. It's one thing to have all these information silos across all of your tools, which is pretty much what almost everybody has right now, right? People have been investing in tools and nothing talks to each other really well. So what are we lacking? We're lacking that defense, that zero trust type of defense around every connection, every time. And we are also critically lacking context overall of the organization, particularly for people who are operating workloads in cloud or in multiple clouds, which again is far more the norm than the exception right now. Especially when I think about the need for that broader context and visibility, that's something that everybody is looking for and trying to understand how they can achieve.
No, for sure. And I'll even go back a couple steps further along that timeline. I think most organizations need to start with a strategy, and they have to think through about what sort of what part of their data sets are most privileged, which ones are absolutely, without a doubt, the most important things to sustain their business and sustain their ability to serve their clients, their customers, or their citizens. It's also a case of when you look at this whole structure and you get to this point of, what do we do? We're here to serve our citizens, and they're expecting that frictionless experience, but it has to be one that's so highly secure that they have trust. Trust now has to underpin every part of that process. And you mentioned that, that really important part of adversarial activities and testing that from the outside, for sure. But even before all that, I would suggest that, and again, I'm a threat intelligence guy, so I'm going to go back to my roots. It's about threat intelligence. It's situational awareness. We need to be able to be in a position to understand what's going on out there all of the time. But we also need AI, and this is where we weave back in that discussion around cognitive and automation, is not only do you need to be able to ingest as much as you can, you need to be able to sort and prioritize all those things. And only AI can do that in this kind of volume, world of volume and velocity. Yeah. And then we have to be able to contextualize that quickly, because of the few humans we do have in our security operations centers operating our world-class SIEM like QRadar. You have to be able to give them an opportunity that they can work at the highest level of priority, versus being dragged down and having to Google different terms and events and conditions and solutions. So, we've heard all these horror stories, both of us have, and discussing things with clients. And so anyhow, that's all part of stuff I want to underline as well. I think the formula is pretty clear for folks.
Yeah, the struggle is very real. I remember at IBM Think a few years ago, we had a session that was literally called 70% of a security analyst time is wasted unless you're using IBM Watson for QRadar. And a lot of it was around having the cognitive assistant that is so much smarter than a Google search, which unfortunately is still where a lot of security teams turn to first, is just a straight up Google search.
Oh, for sure. No doubt. So we've covered a lot. We've looked at some of the, we looked at the root causes. We looked at some of the historical drivers to the environment, going way back to 1982. We've talked about some of the enablements now and some of the fresher approaches and strategies. What else is top of mind for you?
Well, I'd like to talk about something really exciting that we have coming from IBM. A big part of a zero trust agenda is how you manage identities. And there's a lot of things tied up with that. With identity and access management. So there's a whole question of how you do your identity governance, how your user onboarding and offboarding, and how do I start to implement controls like continuous access control, adaptive access. Privacy and consent management is a huge area that's starting to heat up now too, especially with the changing dynamics around privacy regulations and privacy requirements. That's also happening in Canada. And we just recently announced the availability of IBM Security Verify hosted in Canada, which is super exciting for us. For decades, IBM has had a suite of very strong identity access management tools. And now we've brought this all together into a single identity platform, which is available as a Canadian hosted solution which has been authorized for Protected B, for those in the audience who work with or are familiar with our federal government. So, this gets really interesting because we now have a single identity and access platform that can support multiple IAM use cases, whether you're looking for consumer identity management, or you're looking for privacy and consent management, or you're looking for privileged access user management, or identity governance, or identity analytics and adaptive access, so that you can monitor and threat hunt in the identity realm. And that's something that we newly have available, which makes that whole let the good guys in, keep the bad guys out challenge a lot easier for organizations.
Yes, indeed. And you said a couple of magic words: adaptive access. I know there's this panacea, there's this utopian world of decentralized identity. We will get there. I don't think, from what I understand from speaking to a lot of subject matter experts, we're quite there, and hence the adaptive access benefit. And this is leveraging behavioral analytics and endpoint analytics and a lot of telemetry that is readily there. I remember even thinking about this and learning about the reality is that most threat-related information that already exists directly or right inside your own organization. You just can't see it. And you can't see it because you're not using the right tools. You can't see it because you can't interrogate the data no matter where it is. And then, of course, we've run into that problem of encryption. And how do you do all that? Of course, with Cloud Paks, we've solved that problem, Cloud Paks for security. And that gives us that ability then to be able to, irrespective of where your data is, you can protect it. And let's go back to why is this important and everything you just described, because nobody predicted the pandemic, obviously. Nobody has yet to completely see clearly through what will be the consequences, medium and long term, from that. Some things will be difficult still. A lot of things are going to be extremely positive. We're about to undertake, I suspect, as most of us have heard, read, and sensed, is a digital revolution. And part of that's already occurred in the sense that we're moving to the cloud. It has accelerated that journey, and the hybrid multi-cloud is in. The question is, how do you defend that now? And how do you get the right kind of tool sets and the right kind of approach? Identity is a clear keystone to that success. And doing it with one console, as you described with IBM Security Verify, is certainly going to be where the industry is going as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You know what, as we've observed in what I call the stampede to cloud that we've seen in the last year or so, it's the thing about cloud data is that you certainly get a lot of data from your clouds, but from a security point of view, that data is really, really hard to discern. So the ability of the IBM Cloud Pak for security, for example, anything that allows you to interrogate your data regardless of where it lives, or allows you to, as I like to say, bring the analytics to the data instead of the other way around. This is what's really going to enable security teams, regardless of what industry you're in, to rise to that challenge and meet that transition to cloud head on. Since we're talking about software, the last thing that I want to touch on before we wrap up is the software supply chain attacks that we've seen recently. I mean, this is looking to be the new boogeyman for sure. The subtlety and the sophistication with which these people have been able to infiltrate software supply chains and compromise trusted software, trusted IT management software for nefarious gain, that's certainly alarming. And yet at the same time, that's not entirely unexpected. In this industry, we've been cautioning against software supply chain vulnerabilities and the possibility that trusted code could get infected for quite some time. So what do people do to defend against that?
Well, that's why the other part of that keystone supporting this whole new security perspective having to deal with a hybrid cloud environment is the issue of DevSec Ops. We need to understand, if you basically deconstruct those more recent attacks, and you can recognize a couple of very key elements to it. One is the convergence thing that we talked about earlier. This is a convergence of interests and capability. This is nation-state capability now transitioning and being imported into the hands of threat actors who generally have criminal, profit-driven motives. But they also do this in a world where if they're going to remain protected by their nation states, they have to play within certain rules. Part of those rules are to help, in some ways, to disrupt large industries, Western societies in general, and Western governments, and so on. So they're going to be extremely sophisticated. They are now extremely sophisticated. They will be increasingly so. And that means they're going to go after the less brute force type of attacks, and they're going to be far more long-term, very strategic, and they're going to go after the fundamentals of coding. And so in the world where we said just a few moments ago, we're rushing to build cloud native apps, we have I think some organizations let their guard down around the need for embedded security. And hence the discussion of late has been driven a lot with the things we've had with a number of CISOs, whether it's the financial services sector, I know I've had some in government sectors as well, is how do we best reinvent agile and do it in a way that has security as a fundamental principle in everything we do. And I think that's the space that we're getting to very quickly. And that's the kind of stuff we love having conversations with our clients.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, I think that we need to break for Q&A very shortly. So on an ending note, how do you feel about our future, Ray? Thumbs up, thumbs down, hide under the bed? What should we do?
It doesn't come naturally for me after almost 35 years in national security and looking, I hate to say, unfortunately, at some of the worst behavioral aspects of various governments and different organizations. I do say, and I like you, I subscribe to the optimistic view. Technology will provide us the necessary solutions. Good tech, ethical tech, the kind of tech that significant companies like ours are committed to, are the future. And I think there is a responsible way to achieve everything we need to do. But we do need to be aggressive, I believe, and we do need to be clear and purposeful. As I said earlier, we need to be very much focused on how do we get there? What's the strategy? What do I need to do to invest? Because reacting later without the opportunity of having one really solid preparedness and having a really good response plan, I think will no longer be tolerated. And I strongly believe, and I've seen, being again a student of history, you can see the trend line, will be very consequential for many senior executives if they fail in their mission to protect privacy, protect data, protect continuity of the organization, but especially when it comes to critical infrastructure.
Yeah, I am an unabashed technology optimist, even with all of the stuff that we see and all the very rightful cause for concern. I still ultimately believe more in the democratizing and enabling potential in all of this tech. But you're right; it's about good ethical tech, good ethical tech, good AI. It's about doing things with purpose, right? So have an incident response plan. Make sure it touches every part of the organization. Factor in the non-technical pressure points and factors as well. Don't just react, respond. A response is something that is orchestrated, that is premeditated, that is probably even rehearsed, that is purposeful. Be purposeful in your investments, in your agenda, and embrace the zero trust framework and the zero trust mindset, because it is aligned in exactly the way that critical infrastructure in particular needs to think about 21st century adversaries and 21st century defenses.
No doubt. As again, a longtime practitioner, I have been in crisis rooms in Ottawa dealing with the kidnapping internationally of Canadians, some prominent ones. I've been a breach coach in a number of events where I'm helping organizations, our clients, get through some of the sort of quasi-legal things around disclosure, law enforcement, taking a look at how do you deal with ransomware takers and so on. At the moment of crisis is not the time to come up with a plan. I can guarantee you that, unless you've thought it through in advance and you practice that scenario building and multiple scenarios and have it down as a solid team, because this is not an IT issue. This is not for the CISO for he or she to solve. This is a full organizational discussion, and that team has to be solidly gelled together, and they'll only get there through practice and awareness in advance, some practicing and preparedness to respond.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. So I think now is the time that we break for questions. Yes?
I think so.
All right. Okay, so the first question that I saw was about how insider threats have been reshaped because of remote work. So I think maybe I'll just answer that one first, and then we can kind of look at the other questions that came in during the talk. Remote work, basically what remote work did was it turned everybody into insiders. It brought your insider population, it just exploded. What most people did as a solution to solving the remote work challenge of the pandemic was vastly increased use of VPNs. And who doesn't love a good VPN? We're very used to this. But to draw an analogy, a VPN is kind of like digging a tunnel straight through into your building, and then just trusting that anyone who can get into the tunnel is good to go. And that's clearly not true, right? So it shifted and broadened the attack surface for everybody from the inside out. When we think about critical infrastructure in particular, trying to infiltrate or disrupt, a power plant, for example, probably pre-pandemic may have in some degree involved somebody literally putting on overalls and grabbing clipboard and trying to walk in somewhere. But of course, now that these control points, as I'm fond of saying, ended up in people's kitchen tables, you didn't have to do that anymore. So it made, the co-opting of legitimate user credentials far easier. It also meant that the risk of inadvertent insider threats and exposures went up dramatically as well. All of a sudden, if you're concerned about lateral movement, you had to worry about what kind of home network security your individual employees had. And as a security professional, you can't even begin to wrap your head around it. And finally, for anyone who had only just begun or who hadn't made the appropriate investments in behavioral analytics, a lot of user behavior analytics that might have been working well enough before the pandemic kind of went out the window a year ago because all of a sudden nothing was normal. So how do you detect what's abnormal? And we really saw that exposure or that gap where people had been relying on a certain complacency in how their behavior analytics work, or were relying a lot on the human firewall, because all of a sudden, all of those norms were out of whack. And if you didn't have a behavioral analytics solution that you could quickly tune or adapt, or you could work with to accommodate the new normal, a lot of people were really exposed by that. Ray, is there anything about insider threats and remote work that you wanted to add on to that?
Well, listen, you covered the landscape beautifully. Again, I look at this as a very practical exercise from a planning perspective. And part of that, as we've already talked about in the first half of this particular presentation, was the only thing that's really changed in this pandemic environment, and the fact we've had far more remote work, and now we're seeing a shift back to something that's yet to be defined. It'll be some form of hybrid workplace, as we're all kind of guessing at this point. We're still stuck with the insider challenge, and the insider perhaps has shifted, I guess, intellectually from being one who perhaps could have been more maliciously intended. Could be a bunch of reasons that would motivate that behavior, but they've shifted more, I think, to a preponderance of inadvertent operators. In other words, other persons who are not malicious by their intentions or through their intentions or their actions. They're simply, they are just the pathway to the compromise because of their working conditions at home, the technology you just spoke to, the gaps in around all that. And also the fact that I think being overly extended and blending their lives across multiple platforms, multitasking until 10, 11 o'clock at night, leaves the network, the defenders of the network really scrambling. So final point, absolutely, this is around top flight, top quality SIEM. This is the story for QRadar. This is a story for QRadar with behavioral analytics and endpoint analytics as well. And this is the telemetry that the defenders need to be able to get to a point where they can collapse that timeline. It's also a great, a great opportunity to underline the need for sometimes manage detection and response. You have to be able to, you can't be the eyes there all the time, especially in the off hours. And you look at the way the workplace has changed. It's not so much, can I get a hold of you at lunch, or can we meet somewhere for lunch downtown? Can I drop by your office? It's more about when would you be free over the next 24 hours for a conversation? So that means a network is on all the time. And that means we have to be much more mindful of endpoint protection. And in that case, there's a case to be made around automated forms of that, and including a managed service like our MDR.
Yeah, there was a question that came in around automation, and the question that was asked was about incident response and the role that automation plays there. But I think it's also a good segue into just saying, along with machine learning and artificial intelligence and automation, like our philosophy from IBM Security has always been that these things are there to extend and enable human cognition. We never expect to replace the judgment of a human operator to make the decisions, but we're there to surface the things that they need to pay attention to. We're there to automate, the what I call the stupid stuff, right? So you're not being hung up on human processes where you should not be, where you're using the automation as an enabler, but not as, a way of getting out of making decisions. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. No, I didn't mean to cut in, but no, agreed. And this goes back to something we talked about 15, 20 minutes ago. On the point of incident response, and the idea that ultimately a crisis is not a time to test your plan, or to test what you thought was a plan, or to perhaps build a plan. So all of this stuff needs to be done in advance. We have an outstanding incident response service, because it is highly regarded within the industry for a number of reasons, partially because we also offer our clients great opportunities to build that responsiveness, to build that response capability, and to practice that. Not only can we assist you in building the response plan, we can test it, we can validate it, we can vet aspects of it as well. And we also do a lot with our garage. We bring in a lot of our clients and others. We're happy to introduce people to a garage session to help build out perhaps what's that experience going to look like in real life. And of course, we have our, as I mentioned a little while ago, around our immersive experience with our cyber range. And we can also do that in an operational technology context as well. This doesn't have to be the sort of the more average sort of meat and potatoes sort of scenario around IT and mail servers and so on. We can get right down to any combination of those things. And that's why we are that trusted partner, because we can foresee, based on the fact that we capture over 100 billion security events a day, we have seen it all. And then we turn that up into our own AI, and we protect our own networks, and we give it back to our clients as well.
Yeah. There's a question that came in as well about how to integrate incident response protocols with things like plant operations. And unfortunately, there's no simple answer to that. We can talk in generally about certain considerations that everyone should keep top of mind. For example, understand how much stuff you can do manually should you lose access to your HMIs or anything like that. Things like the Ukrainian power plant attack and the Norsk Hydro breach made it very clear that the ability to intervene manually is critical. So understand what you can and cannot do manually. Understand where you've lost your more experienced workforce that knew how to do this stuff manually, and where you need to bring that knowledge back or reintroduce those controls. There has to be, if you're looking on how you train people and how you optimize those plans, I'll give you a hint. If these plans are in Word documents or spreadsheets or on paper, you're not going to be able to do any of that. Find tools. Things like IBM Security SOAR is a purpose-built security operations and response platform. And that's not just about, building out these playbooks and then using them in the crisis. It's about understanding how to optimize, where to start gradually introducing automation, where to easily back that automation out if it turns out that's not what you want to do. And we have the technology to do that now, and everyone needs to do that. When you're looking at physical plant operations, there's always going to be an aspect of it that has to be manual, that is going to involve somebody suiting up and going in and flipping switches and pressing buttons. But understanding where those boundaries are and how and when and who does that cut over from what you can automate to what has to be manually done, that's really, really, really critical.
No, agreed. And whether it's a case of trying to leverage some of the best in technology, it is the sort of things that you're referring to around SOAR. It is that IBM resilient solution. It is around collapsing that timeline to discover, because sitting still with a dwell time of a little over 200 days before the malware or the penetration has been discovered is just not a viable situation for anybody anymore. And the same thing now, we look at the hybrid cloud environment, you look at the reality that where we shifted our world, our space, our data sets, it comes down to really, again, for that, the issue around what is the leading technologies out there, what is the latest and most innovative, and we're left with only a few at the very top. And I would suggest thinking at IBM Guardian Insights is one example of being able to get at that data very, very quickly to get to it. And that's all part of our Cloud Pack for Security approach and everything we do around containerization and all of the agility that comes from that, from both a operations perspective and security.
Yeah. I'm not entirely sure. I've lost track of how much time we have. I did see another question about best practices for remoting into HMI systems. And I'm going to say that that's a perfect place in your infrastructure to introduce secure edge. Like that's absolutely where you want to start look at applying zero trust, where you're verifying every access, every user, every time, every single attempt. That's a perfect example of where you would want to adopt a zero trust approach and look at services like secure access edge instead of VPNs or just straight up remoting in.
Yeah, in fact, we've built a whole new practice now around security service for SASE, and that sort of reinforces that particular perspective. So no, agreed. It'll just maybe finish off with your last comment around zero trust. It's back to that mindset. It's around that purposeful approach, and that means seeking out the best possible advice and combining that with the best possible technology, doing your homework, making the right kinds of investments, and having the right kinds of conversations you deserve with the right kind of trusted partners out there.
Awesome. Okay, so we have like 2 minutes left, maybe like a minute and a half now that I finally caught that in the chat. I think there was a question about identity too. Oh, here we go. Identity analytics. What data sources can we use, and what features do we target for a good defensive strategy?
Yeah, tough one. It's one of those things where identity analytics comes back to this idea that we've talked about the fact that we've launched IBM Security Verify in Canada and a protected B cloud sort of context around the things we need to do to be able to at least hit a common set of standards. The federal government one is one of those. Within that framework, I know when it comes down to why does Verify work so well, back to our discussion on agile and this idea that you need adaptive access. And adaptive access is a whole bunch of markers that relate to that person's behavior. It's the same kind of leading edge technology we apply to secure our own, let's say, just shy of 400,000 people operating in about 170 countries around the world, where we as users and who have arguably probably some of the most valuable intellectual capital and property on the face of the planet, we protect it ferociously, and we do that with the same kind of approach around behavioral analytics, around all those data points, and all that validation around which technology are you using to sign on to the network, what are you doing in terms of your keyboard strokes, and what sort of behavior it was within that baseline norm versus that anomaly that, again, the analytics will help you identify very, very quickly, and which then sets a different set of parameters around, should Ray have access to all of this or a little piece of this or just this particular task, because it has to be very risk-based. And I think that's where, again, the latest approach to this has been really, I think, defined in our IBM Security Verify approach. I think that's key.
Yeah, for sure. identity agenda has changed so dramatically over the last 3 or 4 years. And I think that like within cybersecurity, we're really at an inflection point on identity right now, where the conversations that we're having and the way that we see this going when we start talking about the near future dream of decentralized identity, for example, it's all starting to change and move very, very quickly.
Yeah, it's trust but verify, but also make sure that that trust metric is very flexible, and it shifts, and it does so in an automated way. So in other words, you're not having to rely on a security analyst to catch up to the incident the next day or next week or next month or, gosh forbid, a long time after that. So I think that's the combination of those best tool sets and the best practices.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's it. I think that's it for our time. I think we're done.
It's been great, Vivienne. Thanks a lot. I really, as always, I love working with you, and love having these kind of conversations. And hopefully, it's been helpful for everybody who's joined our conference. And thank you as well to the siberX folks. This has been a great opportunity.
Yeah, looking forward to giving everybody a high five in the near future.